John Winters didn't just buy a lakefront property, he rescued one. After 30 years as a wildlife biologist specializing in threatened reptile species, he'd watched developers drain one too many Florida wetlands. When 3 acres with a pristine, spring-fed lake came on the market, he emptied his retirement account without hesitation. The property sat just beyond the manicured lawns of Whispering Pines, an upscale gated community where homes started at 7 figures. John's modest cabin and wild, naturalized yacht stood in stark contrast to his neighbor's Mediterranean mansions. But it was what lurked beneath the lily pads that truly set his property apart. Bonnie and Clyde, 2 9-foot alligators he'd rehabilitated after they were injured by boat propellers. The animals, tracked with subtle GPS monitors for his ongoing research, had become something of local legends. Though the lake legally belonged to John, an ironclad deed traced back to 1887 proved it. He'd noticed strangers' footprints appearing along his shore with increasing frequency. Someone was testing boundaries, both legal and natural. Patricia Wilkerson didn't move to Florida to be told no. Back in Greenwich, her family name adorned hospital wings and university buildings. Here in Whispering Pines, she had to settle for HOA president, a position she'd secured through a campaign that promised to restore property values and reclaim community resources. Patricia had first noticed John's lake during her morning power walks. Unlike the subdivision's artificial pond, a chlorinated circle surrounded by no swimming signs, his water gleamed like liquid sapphire under the rising sun. When she discovered her $1.2 million property supposedly didn't include access to the most beautiful water feature in the area, Patricia decided this was simply an administrative oversight. Her first casual visit to John's property ended with him politely escorting her off his land, deed in hand. Her second approach involved HOA letterhead and veiled threats of legal action, but it was her third tactic, swimming at dawn when she thought no one would notice, that crossed the final line. John's wildlife cameras caught her diving off his private dock at 5:43 a.m., sending ripples across the water that stood 2 sets of reptilian eyes watching from the shadows. "You're harboring dangerous animals in a residential area," Patricia declared, standing on John's porch with a cease and desist letter she'd drafted herself. Rain pounded the metal roof overhead, almost drowning out her words. John leaned against the doorframe, unfazed. "Those dangerous animals are tagged and monitored as part of a state conservation program," he explained for the 3rd time that month. "And this isn't a residential area. It's private property outside HOA jurisdiction." He held up his phone, displaying footage of Patricia's pre-dawn swims. Unlike trespassing, which is an actual crime, something flashed behind Patricia's carefully maintained smile, not embarrassment, but calculation. That evening, glossy flyers appeared in every Whispering Pines mailbox announcing a Take Back Our Lake community event that weekend. The flyer featured a photoshopped image of children splashing in what was unmistakably John's lake, with his cabin artfully erased from the background. When John called the sheriff's office, Deputy Rogers sighed. "Civil matter, John. Unless someone gets hurt, our hands are tied." The words hung ominously in the air between them. "Nobody's going to get hurt," John said firmly, "but they might get scared enough to respect private property." He spent that night moving his wildlife cameras and installing underwater sensors that would alert him to unusual disturbances and provide irrefutable evidence of whatever happened next. Saturday dawned with picture-perfect Florida sunshine, as if nature itself was setting the stage. John watched from his screened porch as Patricia led 24 neighbors down the public trail that bordered his property. She wore a designer swimsuit under a sheer cover-up, looking like she'd stepped from a resort brochure. Several families brought children, coolers, and inflatable toys. John's stomach tightened at the sight. He'd spent the previous day creating a clear channel for Bonnie and Clyde to retreat to the far side of the lake, away from any potential commotion. Now he stood, document in hand, as Patricia cut the lock on his gate with bolt cutters, a felony offense his cameras captured in high definition. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced through a bullhorn, "welcome to the Whispering Pines Community Lake." Cheers erupted as she led them toward the water. John stepped into view, deed and phone in hand. "This is private property. You're trespassing. I've called the authorities." Half the group hesitated, but Patricia laughed. "He always says that. There are no authorities coming." She waded ankle-deep into the clear water, arms outstretched like a conductor before an orchestra. "The water's perfect." That's when the surface of the lake began to ripple, not from the direction of John's protected cove, but from the deeper central waters where a large, partially submerged log appeared to be moving directly toward the shore. Except it wasn't a log. Clyde, the smaller but more curious of John's alligators, had broken from their usual pattern. The normally shy reptile, drawn by the unprecedented commotion, glided with prehistoric grace toward the shallows. His ridged back barely breached the surface, but there was no mistaking what approached. A child noticed first, a young boy pointing wordlessly, eyes wide with fascination rather than fear. The scream came from Patricia, a sound so primal it startled birds from distant trees. "Alligator!" She backpedaled wildly, tripping over a cooler and sprawling onto the sand. The exodus was instant and chaotic. Parents grabbing children, towels and toys abandoned, several people falling in their panic to flee. Through it all, John stood calmly filming, careful to document that Clyde maintained a safe distance, showing normal investigative behavior rather than aggression. By the time Sheriff Mills finally arrived, Patricia sat alone on the public trail, mascara streaked down her face, designer cover-up torn at the shoulder. "He tried to kill me," she insisted, pointing a shaking finger at John. "Ma'am, that footage shows you destroying private property and leading a group trespass," the sheriff replied, reviewing John's videos. "And that alligator is tagged and monitored by the Florida Conservation Commission. He's actually about to show me the tracking data." 3 weeks later, at an emergency HOA meeting, Patricia faced her neighbors not as a leader but as a defendant. The association was named in John's lawsuit, facing potential liability for her actions because of Mrs. Wilkerson's documented harassment and criminal trespass. John's attorney explained to the packed room, "My client is willing to settle under specific conditions." By the end of summer, a new arrangement was reached. John established a legitimate Florida wildlife education center on his property, offering scheduled, guided tours that required online registration and a small conservation donation. The HOA newsletter now featured a monthly wildlife corner written by John, and property values in Whispering Pines actually increased due to their association with legitimate conservation efforts. Patricia, meanwhile, sold her house at a loss and returned to Connecticut, where she told everyone who would listen about her harrowing escape from the savage Florida wilderness, a story that grew with each telling, like ripples across a disturbed lake.